I want to welcome you this morning. I'm absolutely delighted to see you. I told Vernon when we were scheduling this that I had some hopes students might be out of the dormitory by 10:30 on a Saturday morning, but it was a challenge. And so we are delighted you're here. I told another group earlier this morning, when I woke up today, I was so happy to get up because Vernon Jordan was going to be with us today. We've been friends for 15 years, close friends, and I have looked forward to this a great deal. So much, in fact, I want to introduce Vernon to you not once, but twice. The first time, I want to just share a few things you need to know. He's the senior managing director of Lazard & Company in New York. He's a lawyer of counsel with Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Herrenfield in Washington. He earned his degree in political science from DePauw in 1957. He earned his law degree from Howard in 1960. Because of his career, he has received 50 honorary degrees. He has received from his alma mater the Ogo Goblet in 1969. He was the commencement speaker in 1973 and again, as a favor to me, in 1993. He received an honorary Doctor of Laws degree in 1973 and received the McNaughton Medal for Public Service from DePauw in 1993. He's been a trustee of DePauw University. He is president and chief executive officer of the National Urban League. He's the former executive director of the United Negro College Fund. Everyone who knows him, who keeps up with current events in even the most superficial way, know him as a close friend of former President Bill Clinton. And in fact, he chaired the transition team when President Clinton assumed office. He's the 2001 recipient of the Spingarn Medal, the highest award given by the NAACP. And what some of you may not know, he is the second DePauw graduate to receive the Spingarn Medal, the first being Percy Julian. Now, that's what I needed to say. That's the first introduction. The second, again, is to truly welcome you and share with you what you probably already know. This morning we're hosting one of DePauw's most influential and most distinguished alumni. We're hosting a person who has maintained his ties with this small school in Greencastle and can speak eloquently about the impact this place has had on his life. When I read his book, I was captivated by the question that I've thought about many times, and that is, well, what is DePauw really all about? And one answer is, we're about offering opportunities to people. We're about offering people opportunities to succeed. And if you look at Vernon's life, and you read his book, and you can kind of relive some of your DePauw experiences as he talks about his. If you read Vernon Can Read, there are probably three things you will quickly pick out, and they are still things our students have in common with one another. The first theme I loved in the book was the role religion played in his life, and how the first person to have impact on Vernon when he came to school was that famous black preacher, Howard Thurman. We still have outstanding people coming through this campus, and I trust they still have influence on the lives of our students. If you read his book, you'll find that he also spent his career building bridges. I love the stories of his relationship with Presidents Nixon and Johnson, Carter, and Clinton. His work with Henry Ford II and Franklin Thomas in the business community. And the themes stressed in his book, I trust, are the same themes we continue to stress at DePauw. Family, his relationship with his mother and his bride, school and the role education played in his life both here and at Howard, and justice as he used his life to work for civil rights. Vernon, I can't begin to express to you how pleased we are to have you with us this morning. Thank you for coming.
President Bottoms, members of the Board of Trustees, faculty, administration, students, I'm glad to be back. I had a conversation with my wife last night, whom I had not seen much of this week, and she said, "So where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to DePauw University." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I got a subpoena from Bob Bottoms, the president." She said, "Well, you've had a lot of experience with that." So I am glad to be back here. I have so many memories. I see John Boffman here, who taught me history. Dean Farber, my buddy Rav Carl over there, who taught me French, and one or two others. And I suspect that those who taught me are somewhat stunned that here I am. But it's really, really wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be here because DePauw has become a different and better place. When I came here in 1953 as a freshman, I was the only black in my class. When I came here as a freshman, there were no black faculty members, and there were no blacks in the administration. But thanks to the leadership of Bob Bottoms, minority enrollment is like 13%. Thanks to his leadership, the minority component of the faculty is about 13%. And I want to tell you, I like that. That's good. And I congratulate Bob, the trustees, and all of you. That pleases me so much. Now, there's a lot to talk about my time at DePauw, and I'm not going to spend much time on that, but I really had a marvelous time here. I talked to some students this morning, and I said, as I said in my 1993 commencement speech, if I had it to do all over again, I would come back here. And that's not rhetoric. That's the truth. I got a very good education. I made very good friends. I was able to participate with the university as a trustee. I got to know Bottoms very well. He is the consummate university president. He comes to visit alumni in their offices and in their homes. And before he leaves your office or your home, he asks for the money. And he got it. I give, I'm gonna give, and DePauw University is in my last will and testament. I hope you do not have to collect soon. Last night, I had dinner in Indianapolis with two of my classmates, Judy Shepard and Joan Mernitz. Our friendship has lasted since 1953. And that is the value to me of this wonderful place, DePauw University. I'm also grateful to DePauw because of the kind of people I met here as a student. Howard Thurman, the first black dean of a major college chapel in this country, Boston University, the Marsh Chapel. I met him here at Goben Church, my freshman year. I also met Harding Carter Sr., the famous editor from Greenville, Mississippi. He would come to DePauw every 2 years or so, and I worked it out with Kent Hawley that I would be his student guide. Now, there was a reason for that. Harding Carter always had in his briefcase a flask of Jack Daniels, which he shared with me. I also met at DePauw University in Bowman Gymnasium Richard Nixon, who was then Vice President of the United States. He had come here to dedicate the Royal West Library. Mrs. DePonte was in charge of the food service. I was a head waiter at Longden Hall. And Pat Sharp was the head waiter at Mason Hall, and she wanted her two best head waiters to serve the head table. And there's a photograph around campus of me, and in the book of me serving Richard Nixon in Bowman Gymnasium. When I succeeded Whitney Young as head of the Urban League, then President Nixon invited me to the Oval Office. And I went, and he did not invite me because I was Vernon Jordan. He invited me because I was Whitney Young's successor. He gave Whitney Young's eulogy in a cemetery in Kentucky. And so I went into the Oval Office, and I sat on my side of the fireplace, and he greeted me and welcomed me to the White House, and I said, "Mr. President, I have brought you something." And I gave him a copy, I showed him a copy of the photograph of me as his waiter in Bowman Gymnasium, and he said, "Where is this?" And I explained it to him. And then I said, "Mr. President, this photograph was taken when both of us were on our way up." And now we didn't necessarily agree, but we did have a relationship, and his politics were different from mine. I have one memory that's worth repeating. Dr. Jomey, an economics professor, was on the campus when my parents brought me to school in 1953. And he was very warm and welcoming, but I never took a class from Dr. Jomey. I always saw him around campus. And in the spring of my senior year at the Phi Beta Kappa Chapel at Goben Church, after chapel, I was headed across the campus, encountered by Dr. Jomey with tears in his eyes, and he said, "Vernon, this was the Phi Beta Kappa Chapel. Vern, this was the Phi Beta Kappa Chapel, and they did not call your name." And I said, "Dr. Jomey, the commencement program will read like this. It will say those graduating with high honor, those graduating with honor, those graduating." And there will be another section that will say, "and others." And that's where I am. The reason I tell you that story is that historically, almost every black student that came to DePauw in the early days made Phi Beta Kappa. Percy Julian, the Leiter brothers from Terre Haute, Marvin Gavin, who is now a judge in Chicago, they made Phi Beta Kappa. And Dr. Jomey just believed that if you were a black student, you made Phi Beta Kappa. And when my name was not called, he was sad. And I remember that because it was such a warm story. Now I want to tell you one other story. When we were here, drinking was outlawed, but there was drinking. And most of it, for me, was in the Beta House. And late one Saturday night, a senior caught us drinking in the Beta House. He was a pre-theological student. Do the seniors still wear yellow corduroy breeches with stuff painted over them? He came in with all of his activities painted on his yellow breeches, and he gave us a lecture as we sat there, slightly inebriated, on the immorality of drinking. And when he finished, either Lenny York or me, I'm not sure which, said, "Now that you have given us a speech on the immorality of drinking, would you give us a speech on the immorality of whether or not we can join this fraternity?" He never bothered out drinking again. Now I want to make a confession, and it has to do with my father. And that confession is that I may be the only student in the history of DePauw University who flunked ROTC. From Colonel Sanders, who ran the ROTC, his son used to be mayor. He taught me ROTC my freshman year. I hated ROTC. And I didn't read it, and therefore I flunked it. But there's a good story. Because I flunked it, I had to take it over the first semester of my senior year. My father came for Old Gold Day, and the ROTC unit had to march in review in the stadium for Old Gold Day. And my father, who was a World War II veteran, sat in the stadium watching me in my Air Force ROTC uniform pass in review, and he wept. So sometimes it helps to flunk. When my parents brought me to DePauw, they left me on Sunday afternoon, Sunday night, on the campus just in front of East College, because that's where the freshman class gathered for the first time. And I remember that scene as vividly as I see you standing here today. My brother Windsor shook my hand and rushed back to the station wagon, happy that for the first time in his life, he would have the bed and the bedroom to himself. My mother, with tears in her eyes, slipped $50 in my pocket, hugged me, and said, "God bless you, son." And my father shook my hand, looked me straight in the eye, and simply said, "You can't come home." And I said, "What do you mean, Daddy? I can't come home." He said, "You can't come home." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Dr. Whittick told us that your reading scores were far less than your classmates, so that when you're reading Baughman's History of Civilization, your classmates will be in chapter 6 and you will be struggling to get out of the preface, but you can't come home." He said, when everybody's going to the second covered bridge, you study. He said, when everybody's got their flashlight and radio and whatever else on their way to Roban Park, you study. And so I said, given all of that, what am I supposed to do, Daddy? He said, read, boy, read. And he walked away. 4 years later, 1957, on a bright June Sunday afternoon, I graduated from this university with a Bachelor of Arts degree. My brother, unhappy, thinking that I was coming back home, slowly came up to congratulate me. My mother, with tears in her eyes, this time slipped me $100 and said, God bless you, son. My father, with the same straight face, simply shook my hand and said, you can come home now. You can come home now. Well, I could go on and on about DePauw. Hey, Bob Schreier, I see you out there. I have written a book, which is why I'm here in part. What I know about writing a book is not much, but I know enough to know that if you write a book, you got to be willing to sell it. And if you're not willing to sell it, you ought not to write it. But I could not write this book by myself, and so I want to tell you how I got a co-author. I have 8 grandchildren. One Saturday afternoon, I was with 2 of them, and as grandchildren I want to do, I was exhausted by them. Totally exhausted, a tad frustrated. I do what I generally do in those times. I went to the bookstore, because I have found over the years that in the bookstore and in the library, you can get lost. And every time I go to the bookstore, the first place I go to is a biography section, so I went to the biography section. And as a result of a course taught by Harry Voltmer in my junior year, American Political Ideas, since that course, I have had a real devotion to Thomas Jefferson. And I saw in the J's this blue book. It said, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, by Annette Gordon Reed. I had never heard of Annette Gordon Reed, and I stood in the bookstore Politics and Prose on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, and I read her preface. She's a black woman from East Texas who went to Dartmouth College, went to Harvard Law School, the first black woman to make law review at the Harvard Law School. She teaches law at New York Law School, and she wrote, with no money, no advance, all on her own, this book about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And she explained in her introduction how she became interested in history. And her explanation was that she studied Thomas Jefferson, and when she studied Thomas Jefferson, in his early years, his playmate was a black kid. And all of a sudden, this black kid in Thomas Jefferson's life disappeared. She was the only black in her class in that East Texas classroom, and she wondered whether she would disappear. And that fueled her interest in history. Monday morning, I called her. I got her voicemail. I hate voicemail. And I left her a message. I said, my name is Vernon Jordan. I'm a Jefferson devotee. I'm in love with Sally Hemings. I want to write a memoir. Having read your introduction, I would like you to help me write my memoir. Will you have lunch with me tomorrow in New York? And she came and she had lunch with me, and she agreed to help me with my memoir. And out of that, a friendship and partnership and a joinder of generations. She is the same age as my 3 daughters, about. And so her sense of curiosity about my time helped me as I transcribed, as I talked into this tape in preparation for this book. So that's how we got started. Why did I write this book? In 1970, my family and I moved to New York, where I took over as head of the United Negro College Fund. When we moved to New York, we took with us Mrs. Gaines, our housekeeper. Mrs. Gaines not only made dinner for us, but she ate dinner with us. There were only 3 of us, and she was a part of the family, so we always ate together and talked. One evening, the conversation was about how Mrs. Gaines, who grew up in Cuthbert, Georgia, just below Columbus, Georgia, in southwest Georgia, the conversation was how in 1950 she got from Cuthbert to Gainesville, Florida. And she told us the story of getting on a Greyhound bus in Cuthbert, mid-afternoon. The white bus driver was on the bus to drive it, and 1 white male passenger. The rest of the bus was empty. She went to the middle of the bus, sat next to the window, and the bus proceeded toward Gainesville, down about Blakely, Georgia. A white man got on the bus, walked to where Mrs. Gaines was sitting, and said, "I want that seat, and I want you to move further to the back." My 11-year-old daughter, Vicki, said, "What did you do, Mrs. Gaines?" Mrs. Gaines said, "I moved, Vicki." And Vicki, in her 11-year-old militancy, said, "Mrs. Gaines, I would not have moved. I would have stood on my constitutional rights. Nobody would have made me move." And Mrs. Gaines very gently touched Vicki's hand, and she said, "Vicki, you would have moved." And it was then that I knew that I had to document for my child what life was like for black people in the South in the 1940s and in the 1950s. I wanted her to understand the surroundings, the atmosphere in which I had grown up. And that was a motivation. And that book is dedicated not only to my parents, but to my 8 grandchildren, in the hope that they will be instructed and inspired by my experience growing up in Atlanta, growing up in the South, in the days of segregation. Now, everybody is curious about the title, which is Vernon Can Read. DePauw has a direct connection to the title. In my sophomore year here, the Continental Insurance Company of Chicago came to campus to interview DePauw students for summer internships. I dressed up, went to the Student Union building, went in, told them I lived in Atlanta, that I'd like to be a summer intern. I got hired. Returned home, went to the Fulton National Bank building in Atlanta, presented myself to the receptionist. I said, "My name is Vernon Jordan. I'm a sophomore at DePauw University, and I am a summer intern here." And the lady looked at me and she said, "No blank." And she called up the executive in charge of summer interns and she said, "There is a colored boy out here who says that he is a summer intern. Can you believe it?" The executive showed up, takes me into his office, and he said, "They didn't tell us." And I said, "They didn't tell you what?" He said, "They didn't tell us you were colored." That was before we got black. You know, it was a progression. Colored, Negro, black, that was before then. And so I said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" He said, "You come back tomorrow and I'll tell you." I went back the next day and he said, "We have found an office for you at the J.L. Wolfe Real Estate and Insurance Company on Auburn Avenue." That's a black real estate insurance company in the black business section of town. And our job, or my job, with his supervision, was to sell income protection insurance to employers employing 5 or more people. It was so boring. He came from downtown to our side of town to take me to see black employers to sell them Continental Insurance. Now, interestingly, my daughter, Tony, is a director of Continental Insurance. The Lord moves in mysterious ways. My mother knew that I was bored, didn't like it, and so she got me a job as a chauffeur for Mr. Robert F. Maddox, a retired banker. Mr. Robert F. Maddox was the epitome of Southern aristocracy. He was rich and he was mean. And my procedure every day was to pick up Lizzie the cook in a 1940 LaSalle. Those old enough to remember, the 1940 LaSalle was a fabulous car with stick shift. And I was a sophomore in college and I loved driving. I'd pick up Lizzie the cook, we'd go to Buckhead. She would make 3 breakfasts. One for Mr. Maddox, which he served him in the bedroom. One for me, which I ate in the butler's pantry because I was both chauffeur and butler. And one for Troy, the yard man, which he had to eat on the back porch. Even in menial circumstances, there are gradations and class distinctions. The yard man could not eat in the kitchen. At some time during the morning, Mr. Maddox would come downstairs, reach into this barrel and select one of many canes, and reach on the table and select one of many hats. And he would get into the 4-door Cadillac, and I would be the driver in my black suit and chauffeur cap, and I would drive him around to the Rose Garden, where Troy the yard man would appear and give him a rose for the lapel of his Palm Beach suit that I had pressed the afternoon before. And we would leave the estate and turn left on West Paces Ferry, right on Habersham, left on Peachtree Battle, right on Peachtree to the First National Bank, where he would stay 10 minutes, 30, 45 minutes, never more than an hour. And then we would proceed to the Capitol City Club, where for lunch he would have a mint julep and a jellied consomme. And then I would return him back to Woodmere, the name of the estate. Because I was also the butler and we would get home at 11:30, 12 o'clock, not later than 12:30, I had nothing to do until I served a dinner at 6:15. And so I spent my time over the loud protestations of Lizzie the cook in Mr. Maddox's incredibly beautiful library, reading his books. Lizzie, the cook, was just outraged. And every day she would promise to tell Mr. Maddox. So one day I said, "Now, Lizzie, I'll make a deal with you. If you don't tell Mr. Maddox that I'm reading in his library, I won't tell Mr. Maddox about you and the grocery man." Her deal with the grocery man is that if the grocery bill was $225 a week, the grocery man charged $300. And every Friday when I took Lizzie home, She had a hen, she had a turkey, she had a ham, which was the dinner after church at Mount Zion Baptist Church where she played the piano. So we worked our deal. One afternoon, I was in the library reading. Mr. Maddox, unable to sleep, was walking around this big Southern mansion in his underwear with a bottle of Southern Comfort in one hand and a glass in the other. And he walked into the library and he found me reading. He says, "Vernon, what are you doing in my library?" I said, "I'm reading, Mr. Maddox." He said, "I've never had a blank work for me who could read." I said, "Mr. Maddox, I can read. I'm colleged." He said, "You go to those colored schools over there, meaning Morehouse, Morris Brown, Spelman, Clark?" I said, "No, sir. I go to DePauw University in Greencastle, Indiana." He said, "White children go to that school?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "White girls go to that school?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, and this defines him, he said, "Are you going to be a teacher or a preacher?" Because that's all he believed that I could be. I said, "No, sir, I'm going to be a lawyer." He said, "You all are not supposed to be lawyers." I said, "I'm going to be a lawyer, Mr. Maddox." He said, "Don't you know I have a place downstairs for the help to read?" I said, "Yes, but you have here Shakespeare and Browning and Whitaker and Sidney Lanier, these wonderful books. You don't want them downstairs in that old dusty place." He said, "Well, just read then. Just read." At 6 o'clock, 6:15, it's dinner time. His daughter and her husband are there for dinner. His son and his wife were there for dinner. And I have on my white shirt and bow tie, a white jacket, a towel on my left arm, and I'm serving Liz's vichyssoise. And as I'm serving the vichyssoise, he says to his family, "I have an announcement to make." "Yes, Papa, Vernon can read." That is the title of my book. The next day, we are driving Mr. Jim Dickey and Mr. Jim Robinson, whose grandson was chairman of American Express, where I sit as a director. Again, the Lord moves in mysterious ways. And as we're driving to the Capital City Club for their mint julep and jelly consomme, Mr. Maddox says, Jim, "Yes, Bob, Vernon can read." Now the sequel is, I worked for him for every summer, for the most part, while I was at DePauw. After I was married and in law school, I worked for him. In 1961, after I was like 6 months out of law school, pursuant to a lawsuit that we'd won in the federal district court in Georgia, I was escorting Charlene Hunter through the mobs at the University of Georgia. Mr. Maddox had then sold his big house, which is now where the governor's mansion sits. And he was in an apartment, and sitting with him was Mrs. Henderson, his nurse. And there I am on television with Charlene Hunter going through the mobs, and Mrs. Henderson said, "Mr. Maddox, do you know who that colored lawyer is?" "No, I can barely see." She says, "That's your chauffeur, Vernon. And he is, as I understand it, to have said, I always knew he was up to no good." There was another man in my life that I want to tell you about. It's my grandfather, Jim Griggs, my mother's father. Every summer, I used to go to homecoming and take an invalid uncle to Tarleton, Georgia, Talbot County. And every summer, I always wanted to ask my grandfather, who was a sharecropper on Mr. Robert Caryer's place. There was a question that I had in my mind, and in 1947, sitting on the porch of his roadside shanty, I got up the nerve to finally ask Paul what I wanted to ask him. And so as we're sitting there in the rocking chairs, I said, Paul, I'd like to ask you a question. He said, go ahead, boy. I said, Paul, at 70 years old, way down here in Talbot County, on Mr. Robert Caryer's place, what is it, Paul, that you want most out of life? And my grandfather said to me, Junior, at 70 years old, way down here in Talbot County on Mr. Robert Caryer's place, all I want out of life is to be able to go to the bathroom indoors in a warm place one time before I die. That was my grandfather's ultimate aspiration. And I was struck by the fact that my grandfather, when asked that question, did not say that he wanted to learn to read and write. He did not say that he wanted to go to the library. He didn't say that he wanted to sit at the lunch counter. He didn't say that he wanted to register to vote. His life was so circumvented and so circumscribed by the reality of segregation and dehumanization that his ultimate aspiration was a basic creature comfort: to be able to go to the bathroom indoors in a warm place one time before he died. And he had no notion, because he couldn't have a notion, that Junior would go to college, would come to DePauw University, would go to Howard University Law School, would head the United Negro College Fund, would be president of the Urban League, would chair a presidential transition, be a partner in a major law firm, be a senior managing director at a huge bank. He was limited by the meanness of his circumstances. So Mr. Maddox and my grandpa are the bookends, one negative, the other blind. But my attitude, based on the inspiration from my parents, was to have faith and confidence in myself, and not to lose faith and confidence in this democracy of ours, the United States of America. On September 11th, I was in my office on the 62nd floor of 30 Rockefeller Center. And my secretary, Jeannie, saw the first plane come down across Rockefeller Center and go right into the first World Trade Center tower. and she yelled out and came into my office, and we stood horrified as we watched the second plane hit the second tower. And we stood further horrified as we watched the second tower fall first and the first tower fall second. I could not help but conclude that terrorism is not new to black people. We knew it through lynchings in the South. And we understood it when the 4 little girls in Birmingham in 1963 could not finish their Sunday school lessons. And I remember Martin and Medgar and Malcolm and Bobby and Jack. So terrorism is not new to us, but what we've always known is that you cannot let it turn you around. And that is what I believe about September 11th, that we as Americans cannot let it turn us around. We gotta keep on walking, and we gotta keep on talking, making the world safe for democracy. I do not wear this flag in my lapel for symbolic reasons. I wear it because I love this country. And I believe in democracy, and I believe in the free markets. And I believe, as I believed as a young civil rights worker, that it was worth fighting for and it's worth dying for. And I believe that America today is worth fighting for and worth dying for. Thank you very much.
I've asked Vernon to tell one more story from his book because it's one of my favorites, and then after that, we'll adjourn the convocation and he'll be in the lobby to sign books until it's time for his plane or his car to take him to his plane to take him back to Washington. Those of us involved with DePauw as faculty or administrators or trustees would hope that we create the kind of environment here in a diverse society where people can learn a lot from each other. There's a story about that and DePauw out of Vernon's book, and I just whispered to him and asked him if he would tell that story of taking some of his friends back home with him to Atlanta, and with that story we'll end the convocation. Vernon?
When I got here my freshman year, I was moved into 106 Longden Hall, which is a big room for 3 students. I came for freshman orientation week. At the end of the week, my 2 roommates came. Roy Carlson from Valparaiso, Indiana, and Russ Foote from a small town just outside of Cleveland, a small industrial town. They were seniors and had planned to spend their senior year together, and they get to 106 Longden Hall, and there I am. We each had a bed, a desk, a closet, and for about 3 weeks, we sort of existed in 106 Longden. One night, I came in from the library about 10 o'clock. And I walked in and I said, "Hi, guys," and they said, "We were talking about you." And I said, "Okay." And one said, we have discovered something and we want to tell you about it." I said, "Okay." They said, "We have discovered that you are no different than we are." In Roy's Valparaiso, there were no blacks that he knew, and in Russell's little town, there were no blacks. There were none at DePauw during the time that they were much. There was that one guy who was in that class. And at that point, in that discussion, we stopped existing and we became roommates and friends. And so as their graduation present, I took them home with me to Atlanta. They both graduated in 1954. And I said, "We're going home because none of us have much money, so we're going by bus." And we took the bus to Greencastle, changed in Indianapolis. Our next stop was Evansville, Indiana. And we got out of the bus station at Evansville, and having been on the bus since Indianapolis, we all had to go to the bathroom. And the signs in Evansville, Indiana, said restrooms, colored, white. And neither had ever seen those signs. And they said, "Well, Vern, what do we do?" I said, "You go that way, I'm going that way." And we will meet right back here. And we rode on to Atlanta, and they stayed at my house, and I took them to NAACP meetings, and I took them to my hangout places around Atlanta, and it was wonderful. Russ became a preacher. Roy went to the Vietnam War. Russ died having preached a New Year's Eve sermon and had an accident. And Roy Carlson, I think, is still in Valparaiso, Indiana. But that's one good story. But there's another good story which sort of says that the problem is not all white people's problem. I used to be head waiter in Longden Hall. Chuck Ichaboo, who's a trustee, used to work for me. He's around here somewhere. Chuck was one of my waiters. And he will tell you I was a good waiter. I was a good head waiter. And there was another waiter who worked for me named Robert Smith. He was from South Carolina. He was a pre-theological student. And I made a deal with DePauw guys who would go on vacation to Fort Lauderdale. And the deal was, if I get to ride and not have to buy gas, when you get to Atlanta, my mother will give you the best Southern cooked meal you've ever had. And that was our deal. And Bob Smith went with us, but he lived in Columbia, South Carolina, so the guys went on to Fort Lauderdale, and Robert Smith spent the night at my house. My mother cleaned up, we went to bed, my father, my mother go to bed. In the middle of the night, my father wakes up and comes into the bedroom and turns on the light and stands for 10 minutes watching his boy and his white classmate from DePauw with a real strong Southern accent sleep, and went back to bed with my mother and wept because he never believed, given the South that he had grown up in, that was ever possible. Thank you. I'll sign books.